My parents spent everything on my golden brother, but a letter in the will from my grandparents changed everything. For as long as I can remember, I've been invisible in my own family. My younger brother, Alex, was always the center of attention, the golden boy. He was the one with all the charm, the athletic talent, and the sparkling personality that my parents adored. It didn't matter if he messed up or broke the rules. They always had an excuse for him. "He's just a kid," they'd say. "He's got so much potential." Meanwhile, I was the quiet one, the background character in my own story. Growing up, it was always about Alex. If he needed help with homework, my parents dropped everything to tutor him. If he had a game or an event, the whole family showed up, cheering loudly from the stands. Meanwhile, my achievements, no matter how hard I worked for them, barely earned a passing comment. By the time I was a teenager, I'd stopped even trying to compete. What was the point? No one cared. When my grandparents passed, I braced myself for the will reading. I knew how this would go. Alex would inherit everything, and I'd be lucky to get a token, thoughtful item, like a photograph or some knickknack they didn't know what to do with. It wasn't bitterness. Well, maybe a little. Mostly, it was just resignation. I had learned long ago where I stood in the family hierarchy. The reading of the will took place in a somber conference room at the lawyer's office. My parents sat on one side of the table, practically glowing with pride. Alex lounged casually in his chair, looking like he already knew he'd hit the jackpot. I sat quietly at the end, trying to blend into the wallpaper. When the lawyer began, everything played out exactly as I expected. The stocks, the savings accounts, and the family's cherished lake house were all left to Alex. My parents clapped him on the back, beaming with pride, while Alex grinned and accepted their congratulations as if it were his birthright. And me? I sat there, doing my best to keep my face neutral. The sting of being overlooked wasn't new, but it still hurt. I told myself I didn't care. I'd already prepared for this. Still, I couldn't ignore the tightness in my chest, the weight pressing down on me as they celebrated around me, like I wasn't even there. As the meeting wrapped up, I started gathering my things, ready to leave and put the whole humiliating ordeal behind me. But just as I was about to stand, the lawyer cleared his throat. "James," he said, his voice measured and deliberate, "could you stay behind for a moment? There's something your grandparents wanted you to see privately." The room fell silent. My parents and Alex froze, their expression shifting from joy to confusion. My mother opened her mouth, as if to question the lawyer, but he cut her off with a polite but firm, "This is a private matter." Alex shot me a look, a mix of annoyance and curiosity, but for once, he didn't say anything. They all filed out reluctantly, leaving me alone with the lawyer. My heart was pounding in my chest as he pulled out a sealed envelope, thick and heavy, with my grandfather's handwriting scrawled across the front. "This was meant for your eyes only," the lawyer explained, handing it to me. I took it with trembling hands, staring at the familiar script for a moment before carefully opening it. What could this possibly be? What could my grandparents have left for me that wasn't already mentioned? Inside was a letter, and as I unfolded it, my breath caught in my throat. The first line alone hit me like a thunderbolt. "James, if you're reading this, it means you've endured years of being overlooked by your parents. We saw it all, and though we couldn't always interfere, we want you to know, you were never invisible to us." I had to stop reading, my hands shaking as I tried to hold back the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm me. This letter wasn't just a message, it was a lifeline. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. And, as I read on, I realized this was only the beginning of the secrets my grandparents had kept. Secrets that would change everything I thought I knew about my family. As I sat there with the letter in my hands, I could barely breathe. My grandfather's words hit me like a tidal wave. James, it continued, we've watched the way your parents favored Alex, often at your expense. It hurt us deeply, but we respected their choices as parents, even when we didn't agree. What you need to know is this. You've always been the one we trusted. Your kindness, your resilience, it's why we made the decisions we did. I read the next part twice to make sure I wasn't imagining it. My grandparents had left me the bulk of their estate, the lake house, their investments, and the majority of their savings. I felt my breath catch. This wasn't just a token of love. This was life-changing. But then, the letter took a turn I didn't expect. There's something else we need you to know, my grandfather wrote. Alex isn't your biological brother. Your parents adopted him when he was a baby after struggling to have a second child. Their guilt and fear of him feeling unwanted shaped how they treated you. None of this was fair to you, and for that, we're sorry. My hand shook as I read those words. Alex wasn't my brother? My mind reeled. Suddenly, the endless excuses for his behavior, the constant favoritism, and the way my parents bent over backward for him, all of it made sense. They weren't just playing favorites. They were compensating for something I never even knew. The lawyer, who had been watching me carefully, cleared his throat. I know this is a lot to process, he said gently. If you have questions, I can answer what I can. But I couldn't speak. Everything I thought I knew about my family had just been turned on its head. For a moment, I wondered if I should confront my parents, but something held me back. Not yet. I needed time to process this new reality, to decide how to handle this bombshell. What I did know was that for the first time in my life, someone had truly seen me. My grandparents had seen the quiet, invisible child I'd been, and they'd chosen to lift me up in a way my parents never had. The inheritance wasn't just about money or property. It was proof that I mattered. It was freedom, and it was validation. And deep down, I knew this secret wouldn't stay hidden for long. Once my parents and Alex found out, there would be consequences. But for now, I just sat there, gripping the letter. My world forever changed. The next few days felt like a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter, reading it over and over, trying to piece together what it all meant. Every memory I had of my family now felt like it had a shadow hanging over it. The favoritism, the dismissiveness, it all had a reason. And it wasn't me. It was never about me. At first, I thought about keeping the secret. Maybe I'd just quietly move into the lake house, invest the money, and let my family believe whatever they wanted about the will. But deep down, I knew that wasn't realistic. This was too big, too explosive to stay buried. And I was right. The truth came out faster than I expected. My parents, already curious about why the lawyer had kept me behind, started asking questions. Did your grandparents leave you something? My mom asked during one of her overly casual calls. Yes, I said simply, deciding not to elaborate. What was it? She pressed, her voice growing sharper. I stayed vague, but she wouldn't let it go. Within days, Alex found out through sheer persistence. He called me, and his voice was a mix of confusion and anger. What did Grandpa and Grandma give you? I hesitated, but I wasn't going to lie. The lake house, I said. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. And the investments, I added, bracing myself. And most of the savings? Alex exploded. Are you kidding me? That's everything. Why would they do that? That house was practically mine. I spent every summer there with them. He wasn't wrong. Alex had been their golden grandson too, but I could tell he hadn't even considered the possibility that I might have been more than just an afterthought to them. They had their reasons, I said, trying to keep my voice calm, but Alex wasn't having it. You don't even have a family. What do you need a lake house for? You're just going to let it sit there while the rest of us... He cut himself off, but I knew what he was thinking. The next day, my parents showed up at my apartment unannounced. My mom was fuming. Why didn't you tell us about the will? She demanded, storming in like she owned the place. Because it's none of your business, I shot back, trying to keep my composure. It is our business, she snapped. That lake house belongs to this family, not just you. You need to think about what's fair here, James. The nerve of her words nearly made me laugh. Fair? Now they wanted to talk about fairness? But then, before I could say anything, my dad stepped in. Why would they leave it to you? He asked, his voice quieter but no less accusatory. Alex is their favorite. They practically raised him there. I took a deep breath, knowing this was the moment I'd been dreading. They left it to me because they saw what you never did, I said evenly. And there's something else you should know. I pulled out the letter, handing it to my dad. He hesitated before reading it, and as his eyes moved across the page, I saw his face pale. My mom snatched it from him, her reaction just as stunned. What is this? She stammered. It's the truth, I said. Alex isn't my biological brother. Grandpa and Grandma wanted me to know. And now, so do you. The room fell silent. My mom's face turned red, her lips opening and closing like she was searching for the right words, but couldn't find them. My dad just stood there, shell-shocked. Alex, who had come with them, looked from me to my parents in disbelief. Is this true? He asked, his voice cracking. My mom broke down, sobbing. We didn't want you to feel different, she cried, grabbing Alex's hand. You're our son. You'll always be our son. But Alex pulled away, his face twisted with anger and betrayal. You lied to me, he said. My whole life, you lied to me. And just like that, the perfect illusion my parents had built came crashing down. The golden boy wasn't so golden anymore, and for the first time, I wasn't the one being overlooked. The days following the revelation were filled with tension and silence. My parents left my apartment in shock, my mother crying and my father avoiding my gaze. Alex had lingered for a moment before storming out, too angry to speak. I thought that might be the end of it, but I was wrong. The call started soon after. My mother reached out first, her tone a mix of guilt and pleading. She didn't demand outright that I share the inheritance, but her words were laced with expectation. She spoke of Alex's devastation and his need for support, subtly implying it was my responsibility to fix things. Each word chipped away at my patience. For years, they'd ignored me, only to now appeal to family when it suited them. Alex, meanwhile, couldn't stay away. A few days later, he showed up unannounced at the lake house. His frustration was barely contained as he questioned why I deserved the inheritance. He threw barbs about my single life and lack of a family, words meant to wound. But I'd had enough. The lake house wasn't just property. It was proof that someone had finally seen me. For years, I'd been cast aside while Alex basked in endless attention. Now, for the first time, I was the one who mattered. As Alex stormed out, slamming the door behind him, I felt a weight lift. That evening, I sat on the deck of the lake house, watching the sun dip below the water. It was peaceful here, a place that felt like it was finally mine. but I knew this wasn't the end. My family wasn't going to let this go quietly. The fallout from the inheritance only grew more intense. My parents and Alex weren't the type to let things settle, and soon their frustration turned into a relentless effort to wear me down. It began with an onslaught of phone calls from my mother. She tried to keep her tone measured, but the subtle manipulation was impossible to miss. She talked about family unity, how the inheritance could help everyone, and how my decision to keep it all was selfish. The focus was always on Alex, his family, and his supposed need for the inheritance. The word fair was thrown around constantly, as though fairness had ever been a consideration before now. My father joined in, though his approach was quieter. He didn't try to argue outright, but made it clear he disapproved of my decision. His tone carried the weight of disappointment, as if I was the one disrupting the family. Between the two of them, the calls were endless, each one laced with veiled guilt and expectations I had no intention of meeting. Alex, however, was anything but subtle. His frustration spilled over in angry messages, accusing me of being selfish and of taking something that was rightfully his. He insisted that the house meant more to him, pointing out how he had spent countless summers there with our grandparents. The irony wasn't lost on me. He had always taken their love and attention for granted, yet now he was desperate to claim it as his due. The tension finally came to a head when Alex showed up at the lake house, this time with my parents in tow. They claimed it was just a visit, but their true intentions were clear from the start. My mother's passive-aggressive comments and Alex's simmering anger hung in the air, while my father maintained a pointed silence that said more than words ever could. It didn't take long for the facade of civility to break. They framed their arguments as reasonable requests, suggesting I let the family use the house, that I reconsider keeping it all to myself. My mother pushed the idea that it was unfair for me to hold on to something so central to the family's history. Alex backed her up, insisting that he deserved a share of what he believed had always been meant for him. Their words grated against me, each one a reminder of years spent being overlooked and dismissed. My patience wore thin as I pushed back, repeating what I'd told them before. The house and the inheritance had been left to me for a reason, and I wasn't going to undermine my grandparents' decision. The argument that followed was heated and circular, but in the end, they left, their frustrations unresolved. That evening, as I sat alone in the quiet of the lake house, I felt the weight of everything that had happened. The pressure from my family had been relentless, but it only strengthened my resolve. This inheritance wasn't just property, it was validation, a rare acknowledgement of my worth from people who had truly seen me. Even so, I knew my family wasn't going to back down easily. Their determination to push me into submission hadn't waned, and I would have to be ready for whatever came next. As the days went on, my family's efforts to regain control of the inheritance escalated. Their phone calls and unannounced visits turned into coordinated attempts to pressure me through other means. It seemed they had realized that guilt alone wouldn't work, so they shifted tactics. My mother began reaching out to extended family, spreading her version of the story. Soon, I started receiving calls from aunts, uncles, and even cousins, all echoing the same sentiment. I was tearing the family apart by refusing to share. They framed their concerns as neutral, as though they were mediators rather than unwitting participants in my parents' campaign. "Don't you think Alex deserves something?" one cousin asked, her voice dripping with faux concern. "He has kids to think about, and you don't even need all of that money or the house." It wasn't hard to see where the narrative had come from. My parents had painted me as selfish and ungrateful, a villain hoarding wealth while the rest of the family struggled. Each call felt like another battle in a war I hadn't asked for, but I stood my ground. The turning point came when I heard about Alex's next move. He had started making public posts on social media about the injustice of the will. Without naming me directly, he shared vague stories about being mistreated and how his grandparents' intentions had been ignored. It was clear he was fishing for sympathy and trying to turn public opinion against me. Friends and acquaintances began reaching out, asking if the posts were about me. Some were supportive, others less so, but the sudden exposure added a new layer of stress to an already exhausting situation. One evening, I found myself scrolling through Alex's posts, anger simmering beneath the surface. He'd shared old photos of the lake house, captioned with sentimental musings about his childhood memories there. The comments poured in, filled with sympathy and outrage on his behalf. It felt like a betrayal, not just of me, but of our grandparents, who had made their decision deliberately and with care. Alex wasn't honoring their memory. He was using it as a weapon to reclaim what he believed he was entitled to. As the pressure mounted, I began to lean more on the solace of the lake house, the quiet, the beauty of the water, and the memories of my grandparents brought me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. It was a reminder of why I needed to stand firm, despite the chaos unfolding around me. I spent time reflecting on what my grandparents had written in their letter, their acknowledgement of the years I had endured being overlooked. They had chosen to lift me up when no one else had, and I wasn't going to let their decision be tarnished by my family's bitterness. Still, I knew this wasn't just about the house or the money anymore. It had become a battle over control, over years of unresolved resentment and favoritism. My parents and Alex weren't just fighting for the inheritance. They were fighting to preserve the illusion of the family they had built, an illusion that was now irreparably shattered. As I stared out at the lake that evening, I resolved to hold my ground. This was my moment to reclaim my sense of self, and I wasn't going to let them take it away. The tension finally erupted when my family's persistence turned into outright boundary breaking. It began with subtle jabs, like an inexplicable complaint to the homeowners association about noise violations at the lake house. I quickly traced the source back to Alex, who had filed it despite knowing I had barely left the house, let alone caused a disturbance. Soon after, my parents arrived unannounced, their car parked conspicuously across the driveway. My mother launched into yet another plea for family unity, heavily laced with criticism of my refusal to share the inheritance. She spoke as if my decision was a betrayal of everything our family stood for, conveniently forgetting the years I'd been left out and dismissed. My father, as always, stood by quietly, his silence more frustrating than her words. It was clear this wasn't just about money or property anymore. Their appeals for fairness and unity were thinly veiled attempts to cling to the illusion of control. But the breaking point came when I returned to the lake house one afternoon to find Alex already there, uninvited. He'd brought his family and enough belongings to suggest he planned to stay indefinitely. He dismissed my protests with the excuse that it's the family home, as though that justified his actions. That moment felt like the culmination of everything I had endured: the entitlement, the disregard, the relentless assumption that I owed them something simply because they had decided I did. When Alex finally left, his accusations of selfishness trailing behind him, I knew there was no more room for compromise. The inheritance was never about taking something from my family. It was about honoring the faith my grandparents had placed in me. Despite the noise, the manipulations, and the outright hostility, I wasn't going to let that be overshadowed. My grandparents had chosen me for a reason, and I was done justifying it to people who had spent my whole life ignoring what I had to offer. Their attempts to undermine me had failed. For the first time, I wasn't the one trying to prove my worth. I already had it, and I wasn't about to give it up.